would you do if one day you discover that the friendly neighbor you greet and chat with every day actually have a horrific secret in his basement? A freezer full of human flesh from the 1980s, a mysterious house at 3520 North Marshall Street, Philadelphia, USA, suddenly began to emit a horrible odor that terrified the entire neighborhood. The smell was so bad that people were used to walking past with masks on. Surely, everyone thought he's just a dirty creature. No one could have imagined that at that time, deep in the basement of this house, a shocking secret was hidden. The cause of the foul odor was from dead woman imprisoned deep in his basement. Gary had a poverty childhood, full of illness, and was abandoned when he grew up. He always yearned for his own family and succeeded in achieving this goal twice. However, both times his wife fled and took their children elsewhere. So Gary found a drastic solution to ensure that the woman in his life would not escape, starting with renovating the basement. If you have offended a heart, please be warned, this is not a typical crime scale. In fact, the story of Gary Heidnik and his victim must be described as disgusting. All information shared in this episode have been carefully gathered from multiple published sources, including news report, legal document, and social media commentary. However, due to the nature of third-party reporting, there may be some unintentional misunderstanding or inaccuracies. We always try for respectful, responsible storytelling, but we appreciate your understanding if any factual error occur. This podcast is part of an ongoing effort to raise awareness, honor the victim, and ask deeply questions about justice and humanity. Thank you for your continued support. And just a quick note, English is not my first language, so if my pronunciation or phrasing ever sound unusual, I appreciate your patience as I work to bring you the story as clearly and sincerely as I can. Gary Heidnik was born on November 22nd, 1943, in Cleveland, Ohio. His childhood was somewhat complicated and eventful. Gary was the first child of Michael and Helen Heidnik. When he was just 2 years old, his younger brother Terry was also born. The two brothers was praised by an extremely strict father. He was willing to use punishment on the two children even when he was just in a bad mood. Michael did not want to be a father and conform to society norm by having children immediately after marriage. So Michael took out his frustration on Gary and Terry, seeing her relationship is not going smoothly and her two children also unhappy. Their mother, Helen, gradually indulged in alcohol to the point of self-destruction, making her mind numb. In 1946, Gary's father had enough, exhausted by difficult circumstances and seeing his wife increasing alcoholism, he decided to ask the government for help. In fact, Gary's father had demanded a divorce and left, leaving Gary and Terry with their mother, a heavy alcoholic. Gary's childhood was truly difficult. The situation worsened when Helen fell into depression. Finally, she decided to send her children to live with their father. 4 months after the divorce, Michael had already started a new life and was even engaged. Gary also hoped that things would be better for the two brothers from then on, that they moved to live with their father and hoped that their stepmother would also love and take care of them. But thing was not good at all. Gary's stepmother was an evil woman who constantly beat and yelled at Gary and Terry. At the time, they was only 3 and 1 years of age. So they didn't understand why their stepmother didn't like them. even when they didn't annoy her at all. Michael and his new wife gradually turned to more brutal behavior. The two find any reason to severely beat up the Gary and his brother. For example, when Gary was young, he had a bed wetting problem. Simply put, he wet the bed, and that's not a big deal for a child. And even if he was beaten right after, he couldn't stop this behavior. Michael was completely foolish and thought that if he shamed his son in front of his friend, Gary would stop bed wetting because he would feel ashamed. We are talking about toddler. Gary wet strategy was often boasted about by his father from his bedroom window so that the children in the neighborhood could see and whisper that it seemed that Gary had wet the bed again at night. As the two brothers grow up, these weird punishment continue, and they was often open staff. Gary realized that the only thing that could help him escape this difficult situation was to go and be at school. Fortunately, Gary did not inherit his father's unpleasant personality and his mother's alcoholism nerve. He studied well, got high grades, especially in math, and the teachers actually loved Gary. Gary's academic path was smooth, but Gary faced many difficulties in his personal life. This was completely normal given his childhood past. Gary had difficulty making friends. He often got angry when someone disagreed with him, to the point where his peers avoid Gary when he threatened them. Friends was almost afraid of Gary because of his many strange behavior and action. People say that Gary often did not look other people in the eyes. He deeply hated women, and whenever a girl tried to approach him to talk, he always found ways to make them leave as quickly as possible. This is during the teenage year. He even yelled at them, "You don't deserve to talk to me." This created a barrier when Gary wanted to make friends with someone. When Gary was 18, his father had him join the army because he thought that studying would only help him get an office job and not really contribute to society. To change his difficult life, Gary followed his father's advice, dropped out of school, and joined the army. Gary hoped that the good grade would help him get into the specialized field in the military, avoiding being sent to the battlefield. But unfortunately, every time Gary tried to join a specialized field, he was rejected in the last minute, and Gary was lucky to join the medical corps thanks to his excellent performance and become a nurse. This was the period when Gary entered his 20s, a time when psychological problems often developed strongly. In West Germany, where Gary was sent to serve in the military as a nurse, Gary began to experience psychological problems. He felt dizzy, had headache, and sometimes his vision got blurry. Gary felt like his brain was about to explode, and his illness was so severe that it affected his work as a nurse. Naturally, initially, the military doctor diagnosed him with an unknown stomach issues, but the prescription medication did not cure Carrie pain, but only plunged him deeper into a world of panic. After being evaluated again by a doctor, this time he received a prescription for anti-hallucinogen and a recommendation for a psychiatric evaluation. Gary was transferred back to the US and evaluated by a specialist. The doctor recommended that he be admitted for treatment. After 13 months of military service, Gary was diagnosed with schizophrenia and discharged from the army. Although he was discharged due to his health condition, Gary had been trained as a nurse in the military, so he could temporarily work in a civilized environment, obviously without treatment or monitoring. Gary tantrum reoccurred when he worked as a nurse in a public hospital. Gary would rage whenever he was disturbed. He terrified patients and even considered insane, and medical staff feel complaint and superior about his behavior. Gary was summoned by manager and fired less than 6 months after working at a public hospital. Based on his employment contract at the hospital, Gary had borrowed a sum of money from the bank to buy a house, but Gary was now in debt and unemployed, so he rushed to find a job to pay off his debt. and his mental state deteriorated further when his mother died in 1970s from alcohol and drug poisoning. Although Gary was 27 years old and not close to his mother, this was the first time he felt the pain of losing a loved one. Gary tried to end his life but failed, and once again he was admitted to a mental hospital. It was in this hospital, in the cleaning room, taking medication all day because at the time the treatment protocol was simply dispensing medication to patients. As Gary began to suffer from paranoia, he believed that he was a messenger of God and his mission on earth was to create a new church. After being discharged, he rushes to arrange his basement into a reception room for believers. Here, Gary named his religion the United Church of God's Servant and proclaimed himself as a pastor. He invested 1,500 in the bank account and began to attract followers. Initially, he attracted poor people or those who wanted just to join a small community to make friends. Information about Gary's religion spread widely through rumors. Everyone believed Gary's sermon, who always claimed to be a pastor of God. He argued that the divinity of Jesus should not be emphasized and his role should be downplayed. Gary claimed to be excellent, that God has spoken to him, that he had seen the light, that he was more trustworthy than Jesus, and so on. Gary collected money from people by asking them to contribute money to attend meeting in the basement. Gary withdrew the money and put it into investment account, hoping that it would bring him a large sum of money later. Gary's religious journey lasted for 10 years, during which time he remained hidden behind closed doors, waiting for followers to come and worship and deposit money at the gate. In total, in 10 years, Gary accumulated $500,000. Even with money, if one health is unstable, it doesn't bring any benefit. With a suicide attempt, he had to struggle with his inner demon. Since his mother died, he felt more alone than ever. Since joining the military, Gary had lost contact with his father and his brother. So in total, Gary tried to leave this world 13 times. 13 times he was saved and admitted to mental hospital for a few weeks before being discharged again and again. Therefore, Gary felt lonely and thought that having a girlfriend could help him feel better and see life more positively. To find a woman who would accept him, Gary didn't need to spend time attending date events through newspaper or joining club. Thanks to his experience as a nurse in the military and at the hospital, he volunteered at the local organization for people with intellectual disability. He continued to approach vulnerable women to make them see Gary as a serious and mature man. Gary flirt, share, and finally meet Annette, a mentally disabled woman. She had a sister named Alberta, who was also being treated in the same hospital as her. From 1977, Gary began dating Annette. They often had sex when they met, and not long after, Annette became pregnant. However, an unbelievable thing happened when Annette Care Facility asked her to leave and move in with Gary. This was a serious mistake because Annette was disabled. Gary, as a nurse, took advantage of his position to maintain a relationship with her. From the beginning, Annette's pregnancy should have been monitored by her care facility, not by Gary Heidnik. When Annette left the facility and moved in with the child's father, she lost contact with her sister, and it seemed like with the entire world. Alberta, the sister, was extremely worried about her. This worry was completely justified because Gary had never lived with anyone else, let alone a pregnant woman with a bunch of hormonal issues and underlying mental disability. Gary controlled every aspect of Annette's life, from food to drink. Whenever he left the house, he locked the door from the outside to make sure that his woman could not escape or face any risk. It looked like he treated her like a dog. Alberta was worried about her sister, so she informed the medical staff that seeing Annette move in with Gary, she had not heard anything from her sister. Unfortunately, Alberta was allowed to leave the facility. She went with the police officer. They went to Gary's house and rescued Annette from this situation. Annette was terrified during Gary's tantrum. She wanted to leave this living hell. She returned to the facility and soon became the mother of a baby girl named Maxine, born in March 1978. The baby was immediately adopted by a family because her mother had mental problem and her father too, and was unable to care for the child from birth. Although Gary seems to have treated Annette badly, he was still alive, allowed to visit the hospital. He met the two sisters and even signed a release form for Alberta. Alberta is the younger sister that did not get pregnant with him, Annette's sister, to leave the facility with him. As usual, the staff at the facility advised Alberta to go with Gary, that it was just a normal trip. After leaving the center, Alberta was taken to Gary's house, where she was about to endure a terrible period. The person who had helped her sister escape this difficult situation now have suffered it herself. Gary wanted revenge because she was the reason he couldn't leave the house and take care of his child. He knew what to do, and the plan was immediately put into action. The woman was locked in the basement. She spent 10 days starved and forced to have sex with him. During that time, no one cared about Albert absent at this facility. No one cared about whether Alberta may be in danger, even though Gary's name was on the permit and he promised to return her within 24 hours. Finally, after 10 days, a staff member of the center discovered this and immediately raised the alarm. The police then arrived at Gary's house and found Alberta still tied up in the basement. After being arrested, Gary was charged with kidnapping, forced sexual act, unlawful detention, perverse behavior, and interferes with the custody right of a mental impaired person. Gary was then diagnosed with schizophrenia again and sentenced to 3 years of probation in another mental institution. But in the 1980s, it didn't help at all. During these tantrums, Gary was forced to wear a jacket and injected with drugs. No one helped him recover or understand his illness. I mean, until this day, we still don't understand schizophrenia. No one helped him recover or understand his illness. And during these 3 years in a mental institution, Gary created his own world. He no longer wanted to live alone and swore that when he escaped this hospital, he would have one or more women always ready to serve him. Gary answered many dating apps in newspaper and was finally contacted by a 22-year-old woman named Betty from Philippines. Betty saw Gary as an opportunity to reside into the United States, helping her pursue her dream of settling down in America. After being discharged from the hospital, Gary decided to buy a new house in Philadelphia. This area was not central and the house was not beautiful because Gary didn't want to use all the money from the basement ceremonies that he had held for 10 years. This was the beginning of Gary's dark story. After buying the house, he sent Betty an airplane ticket to come to the United States. Then they married quickly. But happiness did not last long when Betty realized that she was living in a cage. Gary not only made her life miserable, but also controlled her in every way. He forced her to have sex even when she didn't want to, and she was imprisoned in the house. Fortunately for Betty, she contacted other Filipinos living in Philadelphia. They helped her find a new place to live and prepare for the birth of her child. After escaped the nightmare house at 3520 North Marshall, Betty filed for divorce and sued Gary, but it's yield no result. The police thought that Betty just wanted paper to stay in the US. She gambled her life and lost. 6 months after leaving Gary's house, Betty gave birth to a baby boy named Jesse John. And so, for the second time, Gary lost the chance to be a father. If simple method like locking the door and imprisonment didn't work, he would come up with a new plan and use the basement if necessary. He would be willing to kill. On March 24, 1987, it had been 4 months since Jovina Rivera A 25-year-old woman was imprisoned in the dark basement. During her captivity, this woman witnessed horrific and tragic scene. The tragedy began in November 1986, so 4 months before. While Jovina Rivera was selling herself to earn some money to support her 3 children, Gary Heidnik approached her and flirted. With his handsome appearance and the new car, Gary made Jovina drop her guard when he invited her to his house to use his service. But once the door closed, she was forever forbidden to leave. She was tied up, knocked unconscious, then taken to the basement and hung, suspended. Jovina begged Gary to release her, promised to keep it a secret. However, Gary Heidnik was not like other men. He was a pervert who had been arrested, convicted, released, and admitted to a hospital, mental hospital, multiple times, and were willing to do anything to avoid living a lonely life. Especially, he was obsessed with the power to control women for his satisfaction at any time. When she first stepped into this dark basement, Jovina had no idea that she was about to experience a living hell, or did she think that she would become an accomplice to his act. Gary basement was not the type of basement that we've seen in some previous story. It seemed to be just a deep hole dug beneath the house. Jovina spent her first night in the basement on November 26, 1986, without knowing that what he intended to do with her. The next morning, she saw him come down with a shovel to dig in the basement. Gary began to dig another hole. It would be used to punish women who was held later if they do not obey him. Gary explained his plan to Jovina. He also confided a bit about his situation. He had been a father many times and has always been deprived of custody. He felt insulted and now he would do anything to have his own family. He wanted at least 10 children as soon as possible. The number of women needed in this payment did not matter, and he would success in creating a family. Of course, at that time, Jovina thought Gary was insane, and if she had the chance, she would jump up the stair and run out into the street. But she was still stuck in this basement, and despite her effort to flee, Gary absolutely would not let her out. Jovina only saw a faint glimmer of light from above, so she wouldn't live in complete darkness. This is the moment the story shifts into something darker. The reason I never accept a come over to my place again, not from a Tinder date, not from a Hinge date, or even a semi-mentally unstable friend, because Gary's second victim is his neighbor friend, Sandra. Before Gary brought Sandra into the basement, her relatives all knew him because they have been friends for many years, and Sandra lived in a special care facility too for intellectual disability people. Gary would become the first suspect in Sandra's disappearance because he had signed her release form and never brought her back. After many days of disappearance, the care facility sent a team of police to Gary's house. Okay, remember that he did the same thing, but it was in another city. Now he had moved to Philadelphia. And back in the time, maybe the paperwork was not uniformly distributed. So they was not suspected when he said he knew nothing about Sandra and he had dropped her off near the care facility on their last outing. Because no warrant were issued, the police did not search Gary's house, but they frequently checked in to see if Sandra had contacted him. So by this time, the basement housed 2 girls. The girls' family was worried and wanted news as quickly as possible. Gary feared the police may break into his house and ruin his entire plan, so he forced Sandra to write a fake letter saying that she had run away and was very happy, advertising everyone not to look for her anymore. This fake letter was quickly submitted to the local police by the young girl family. Unfortunately for her, Sandra was a disabled young woman living in a care facility. Her disappearance did not attract much attention, and the letter that she signed herself ended the police search. If the police officer in charge of Sandra's missing person case had checked the letter and the actual situation precisely, they would have saved Sandra's life and prevent six other women from experiencing the strategy in the basement in the damp environment without heating or light. The girl was both in pain and comfortable to prevent the woman from escaping. Gary had prepared everything. Board the sandbag preventing Josefina and Sandra from escaping the basement on their own. Similar to all other captivity cases, in addition to being locked up and abused, another factor that also played a crucial role here: food. Gary did not know how to cook. He served Josefina and Sandra inedible meals, and according to him, this bizarre nutritional menu was a way to properly nourish a baby if they was pregnant. If it had been a month since Josefina Revere and Sandra Lindsay was locked in Gary's basement, enduring his abnormalities and brutal abuse, the young woman had no chance to escape, and the situation in this basement worsened with only a hole on the floor for a toilet. On December the 22nd, Lisa Thomas, 19, went down to the basement, and a few days later, Deborah Dobley, 23. Gary met Lisa Thomas by chance while strolling in the city and met her on the street. He thought Lisa was a prostitute, so he stopped and asked for the price of a night service. However, she was not that kind of person, so to compensate for his mistake, he offered to take her for a ride in his Cadillac. Lisa accepted his apology, and Gary happily took her shopping for clothes, to dine in luxurious restaurant, and took her home before locking her in the basement. Unlike Lisa, Deborah Doppler worked as a flower vendor and she accepted Gary's invitation. With four women in the basement, Gary became more direct and cautious. He feared that they may escape, so he often used force to abuse them, causing the woman to become exhausted and weakened over time. To save money on food, hamburger meals were replaced with dog food. Gary realized that Josefina, Sandra, Deborah, and Lisa would gradually become weaker, but they could scream at any time. So when he was home, Gary would easily monitor who was screaming or making noise. But when he left the house, how could he ensure that no one could call for help from the basement? This was simple: by making them deaf in his absence. Gary used a screwdriver to damage the hearing of these poor women, leaving them in permanent silence. There was no official search for these women. You may think that the disappearance of six women with a few months would attract the attention and concern of the authority. But no, we were living in the 80s. These young women were all poor black women working as sex worker or having mental disability. Except for their families, no one cared about that situation. And unfortunately, due to the indifference of the authority at the time, Sandra was the first to pass away in the basement. She was a sincere and passionate young woman. She was one of a few slaves who did not lose her will to live while in capacity. After a few weeks, she constantly resisted. I'm sorry when I get emotional, my tongue stopped working. She cursed Gary and screamed when he approached. Her biggest mistake were probably underestimating Gary's dangerousness and craziness and inhumanity. She knew he could use torture, but Sandra had known Gary for 2 years and she was his friend and did not think that he was capable of killing someone. In February 1987, Sandra and the other woman tried to escape. When he discovered the boat had moved, Gary dragged Sandra out of the basement and hung her on a hook without food or drink. Gary thought Sandra was pregnant, so he tried to feed her, but she vomited everything. Completely exhausted, one morning in February, Sandra did not wake up again. The other woman tried to wake her up, called Gary to the basement, but Sandra Lindsay was gone. Her heart had completely stopped beating. The pervert did not panic. He explained that Sandra suffocated from choking from a piece of cake that night, and it was not his fault. Sandra Lindsay was the first to be placed in the underground freezer. The situation changed from here because someone had died. The remand woman understood that at this point, Gary had crossed a new line. Gary also knew that he had gone too far because Sandra's body complicated his problem. He knew her family was looking for her. She was the only one whose family was searching most intensely. So how could he eliminate her presence? When you think the police were lurking around your house and you think you go out with a 1.75-meter long trash bag, he thought simpler. Cut her into pieces. Over several days, a foul odor filled the house to the point where the neighbor complained to the authority. And still, nobody do anything. They say that Gary seemed to be cooked something strange in the house and the smell was so awful it was unbearable. An investigation team was dispatched and they also smelled the terrible odor coming from the house. However, Gary explained everything naturally and casually, saying that he had forgotten a bowl of food in the oven while sleeping during the day, and it was just an accident, and the strong smell was because he had overcooked the food. He apologized and promised not to do it again. So the inspection team just left. After this incident, Gary became increasingly worried about the possibility that the police will raid his house. Therefore, he should find way to silence the woman in the basement. Gary frequently punished them by pouring water into and filling the basement. Additionally, he placed electricity wire in the water, which was activated by a simple button. If the woman screamed, he would press the button and they would be subjected to pressure that caused difficult breathing. Also, at this time, Josefina was forced to participate in Gary's crime, becoming his accomplice because she had been there for months and had become part of these dark action. Gary trusted Josefina and she knew it. If she wanted a chance to leave, she had to do everything Gary wanted. On March 18, 1986, when he asked her to press the button to electrocute the other woman, Josefina did exactly that, even when the other girl begged her not to do it. Not to listen to Gary, Josefina still pressed the button, and this time, Deborah died in this horrific situation. Gary asked Josefina to dispose of Deborah, continued to put her into the freezer. A few days later, Deborah was abandoned in the Pie Barren area of New Jersey because he did not want to disturb the neighborhood again because of the smell. In March 1987, Josefina successfully gained Gary's trust. She had been in the basement for a long time, 4 months, survived every hardship, and even helped him dispose of Deborah. The young girl was sometimes allowed to eat with him and even helped him gain the trust of Agnes Adam, a 24 years old prostitute, so that she could get into his car and walk at Gary's house. Like the other girls, Agnes was now in the basement, but at the end of the month, Josefina had a request. She wanted to contact her family to explain that everything was fine and she was healthy and not kidnapped. She found a convincing reason for Gary. If he let her talk to the family, Josefina would agree to have him bring other women into the basement. Gary accepted immediately. So on March 24, he took Josefina near a gas station not far from her parents' house so she could go and knock on their door. He asked her to return within half an hour, but on that day, Josefina did not visit her parents. There are many versions of Josefina's escape. Some say that she went into a gas station to ask for help, or she knocked on the people's door for help. The official version of her escape is in her own book, written after the event titled Josefina. Where Josefina tells her tragic and horrific story, she asked Gary to take her near a gas station, but the girl did not go there. She knew that on the next corner there would be a public telephone booth. So she told Gary that where her parents live is where the phone booth is. My telling this story make my goosebumps. So So Gary let her go there and agreed to meet her in half an hour without any suspicion. Josefina tried to walk slowly so Gary wouldn't suspect her escape. When she reached the public telephone booth, she called 911 immediately and quickly spoke to an operator. Josefina quickly told her everything she had experienced in the past few months, the woman in the freezer, the home Gary had dug, the electric shock. The person on the other end of the line say everything was so unbelievable that even hesitated for a moment before sending the patrol team. She knew if Gary rushed in, he would see her talking on the phone and that she also knew that her life would end in the freezer. Finally, an investigation team was dispatched. Upon arrival, the investigator asked Josefina if she had any evidence for what she had said. They would not break into someone's house, a white man's house, if it was unfake. Josefina, all she needed to do was raise her hands and arm and entire body, which was covered in scar. Within 4 months, she had endured continuous beating. Everything had left its mark on her body. Looking at her condition, the police immediately believed her. Josefina said that Gary was at the gas station right around the corner and could run away at any moment. The police officer quickly surrounded the gas station. Another patrol team was also called to assist. Seeing the police arrive with weapons, Gary did not try to run and simply innocently stated, "What did I do? I remember I already transferred the child support payment." After Gary was arrested, the patrol team went to the house to check if Josefina's words were true. The front door of the house were broken down and the police immediately went down to the basement where they discovered everything that Josefina said were true. The freezer, and the woman in the basement. Lisa Thomas, 19, Jacqueline Askin, 18, and Agnes Adam, 24, was lying on the floor in the worst possible condition. In the basement freezer, they found countless disgusting things that I'm sure more than a few police officers at the time were nauseated by. You can imagine ground meat being prepared, or it's like people freezing meat to cook for a few weeks. Josefina almost got into trouble when Lisa and Agnes claimed that she had participated in the torture and that even seemed to enjoy doing it. Josefina argued that she had no other choice to survive and that gaining Gary just was the only way to leave the payment and call for help. 4 months. She was there 4 months. She really did that. The court clearly considered the entire case and decided not to charge her, although she was almost considered an accomplice. After the trial in November 1988, Gary was convicted of unlawful imprisonment and murder and sentenced to death. He was executed by lethal injection on July 6, 1999, without any apology for all the crime that he had committed against these young women. Afterward, all surviving victims received $30,000 in compensation from the government. Josefina was reunited with her 3 children and witnessed Gary's execution. Lisa Thomas and Agnes Adam become involved in drug addiction and experienced many psychological problems after being released. In contrast, Jacqueline Askin become a cleaner, had 2 children, and was received treatment for anxiety. She frequently experienced nightmares about going back into the basement. Lisa, Agnes, and Jacqueline never forgave Josefina for having Gary torture them, even though her plan ended up helping them survive. It's heartbreaking that this is how the story of Gary Heidnik ends, a man who kidnapped 6 women and took them to his basement when no one searched for them. And I think it's certain that if Josefina hadn't succeeded in manipulating Gary and escaping to alert the police, everything would have ended in the basement of that house, the same way for every single one. And that is the end of today's story. I'm sorry I got emotional. This case is phenomenal and it brings so much anger and misjudgment out of me. Part of it because it's this woman, part of it because of the incompetence of the way police work. Tell me what you think about this case in the basement. This case in the comment. Take care and please stay safe.